The clay was frozen, his hands were bleeding, and the American with the rifle would not let him stop digging. He was a German soldier, a prisoner now. And only weeks earlier he had been told by his own officers, by the newspapers back home, by every voice he had trusted since he was a boy, exactly what the Americans did to men they captured. They starved them. They shot them in ditches. And when a German died, the Americans left the body in the mud for the crows, because that is simply what enemies do to enemies. So he dug, and he waited for the cruelty to begin. But the grave he was cutting into that frozen ground was not for him. It was 6 feet deep and 6 feet long, and it ran in a dead straight line beside 100 others exactly like it. And when the trucks finally came, groaning up the muddy track, they were not carrying Germans. They were carrying dead Americans, row after row of the young men he had been trying to kill a week before. And the Americans standing over them were not tipping them into a hole. They were laying them down, slowly, one at a time, reading a name off a small metal tag, copying it carefully into a book, and marking the spots so that it could still be found 50 years later. By the time the war in Europe ended, this one muddy field outside a Dutch village called Margraten would hold more than 17,000 of them. And the thing that broke something loose inside that German boy was not the size of it. It was smaller than the number, and much harder to shake. It was that they wrote down every single name. Not just their own, theirs too. The enemies. This is the story of the men whose whole war was the dead. The men America very nearly forgot to thank. And it is the story of what their enemies saw when he watched them work. Because sometimes, the truest thing ever said about an army is said by the men who came to destroy it and could not understand what they found instead. Let me take you out to that field. To understand what haunted that prisoner, you have to understand who was standing over those graves. And it was not the men you would picture. There is a part of every army that no recruiting poster ever showed, no parade was thrown for it, no medal was struck for it. In the United States Army it was called the Graves Registration Service, and its assignment was the simplest and most terrible sentence in the entire war: find the dead, name them, bury them properly, keep the records so exact that no mother is ever handed a telegram that only says her son is gone, with no grave to kneel at and no place on earth where he lies. The cemetery at Margraten was begun in November of 1944 under an officer named Joseph Schoeman, who commanded the 611th Quartermaster Graves Registration Company as the 9th Army pushed up into Holland. Schoeman later wrote a whole book about that winter. He called it Crosses in the Wind. And the men who actually broke that ground, who put the first shovels into frozen Dutch farmland during one of the coldest and wettest winters anyone there could remember, were mostly black American soldiers. The 960th Quartermaster Service Company, the 3,136th, segregated units, some of them led by white officers, handed the work the Army gave to the men it valued the least. Sit with that for a second, because it is the heart of the whole thing. These were men who, back home in Alabama or Georgia or Mississippi, could not eat in the same room as a white man, could not drink from the same fountain, could not vote. And here they were, on their knees in the mud of a country most of them had never heard of, burying thousands of white American boys by hand, one after another, with a gentleness their own country had never once shown them. One of them was a first sergeant named Jefferson Wiggins, 19 years old, from rural Alabama. He tried to put words to it many years later. There they were, he said, a group of black Americans surrounded by all these dead white Americans. When they were alive, we couldn't sit in the same room, and now he was the last human being who would ever touch them. That is the line of his, "I cannot get out of my head." When you lowered someone into his grave, Wiggins said, you were the last human being that dead person would ever have contact with, the last hands. Think about your own son, your own brother, dying in a wet field a long way from home, and then think about the fact that the last careful human thing done for his body was done by a man his own country treated as barely a citizen at all. And that man did it tenderly anyway, every time. At the peak of it, up to 500 bodies arrived at Margraten in a single day. 500, day after day. The mayor of the village went house to house on foot, knocking on doors, asking his own neighbors to please come and help dig, because there were simply not enough living hands to bury the dead. Every grave was cut by pick and shovel through half-frozen earth, 6 feet down, 6 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, and there were thousands upon thousands of them waiting. But before any one of those boys ever reached that field, someone had to go out and find him first. And that was the part of the job that broke men in a way the front line never did. They went out onto the battlefield after the shooting stopped, sometimes before it had fully stopped at all. One of the first American cemeteries on French soil was started on the 6th of June, 1944, D-Day itself. A graves registration sergeant named Elbert Legge was sent into Normandy and told to mark out a cemetery in a field near a village called Blossville, with almost nothing to work with. He paced off the rows himself. He marked the first graves with wooden stakes he snapped from empty ration boxes because that was all he had, and the dead were already arriving faster than he could measure the ground. The work these men did never made it into the movies. On the invasion beaches, they had to cut bodies free from landing craft that had sunk in the shallows, where the tide had pinned the men inside. At Anzio in Italy, the graves registration crews came under artillery fire while they worked, and the only cover on that flat, open ground was the empty graves they had just finished digging. So they climbed down into holes meant for the dead, and they waited out the shelling, and then they climbed back out and kept going. And for every single man they recovered, there was a ritual, and it never changed. Not when they were exhausted, not when 400 had already come through that day. They took one of his 2 dog tags and left it with his body. The second tag went onto the marker above him, so that the name existed in 2 places at once and could never be fully lost. They took his fingerprints. They recorded the fillings in his teeth in case the tags were ever gone. They gathered whatever was in his pockets, a watch, a folded letter, a photograph, a wedding ring, and they logged all of it to be sent home to whoever was waiting. And they filled out a form, Graves Registration Form Number 1, the Report of Interment, so that somewhere in a steel filing cabinet there would be a piece of paper that said, "This man was here, we know who he was, and we know exactly where we laid him." A chaplain came and said words over the ground when a chaplain could be found. And that ground had usually been an ordinary cow pasture the week before. It took something out of them to do this, all day, every day. A private named Thomas Dowling of the 612th Graves Registration Company once tried to explain what it did to the men who handled the dead. "Not many of us were killed," he said, "but we died in different ways. The work was nightmarish, and it ate at our hearts. It cracked some of us, darkened the spirits of others, and numbed the rest. They were not fighting, but they were not surviving it either. They were the ones who had to look, up close and in daylight, at exactly what the war produced, and then measure it, and name it, and write it down. And they did it anyway, because if they didn't, no one else was going to. Now hold on to everything you just heard about how carefully they treated their own. Because here is where that German prisoner walks back into the story. Here is the thing he stood in the cold and could not explain to himself. They did all of it for the enemy, too. You would almost forgive an exhausted, grieving army for tipping its enemies into a pit and walking away. The German army had done exactly that in the East, and far worse. It would have been the easy thing to do. It would have felt, to a lot of men, like the just thing to do. These were the people who had killed their friends. The American army did not do the easy thing. In nearly every cemetery the Graves Registration Service built, there was a section set aside for enemy dead, and the German soldiers buried there went through very nearly the same careful procedure as the Americans lying a few rows away. Their bodies were recovered instead of abandoned. Their identities were recorded. Their personal effects were collected and catalogued, not as souvenirs, but so that they could one day be handed back. The information was routed through the Prisoner of War Information Bureau, exactly the way the Geneva Convention demanded, so that some German mother might also eventually be told where her son was lying, and that he had not simply vanished from the earth. A chaplain, when there was one, said words over them as well, and very often the graves for those enemy dead were dug by German prisoners of war themselves. The rules allowed it, as long as the prisoners never handled the remains. And here is the small human detail that the men who were there wrote down, the thing this whole story turns on. When the German prisoners first started digging, they were slow and sullen and frightened, because in their hearts they were certain they were digging their own graves. They believed the shooting would come next. It was exactly what they had been taught to expect from the enemy. And then, slowly, they understood. The graves were not for them. The men supervising them noticed the change come over the prisoners. They became careful workers, dedicated even. Once they finally understood the truth of what they were doing, everything shifted. The enemy was not going to be shot at the edge of a ditch. The enemy was going to be buried, with a marker, with a name, in a straight and tended row, in exactly the same way as the Americans. Put yourself back inside that boy at Margraten, the one with the bleeding hands. Everything he had been promised about these people was coming apart in front of him. He had been told the Americans were animals who would strip his body and laugh. Instead, he was watching them lift a dead German soldier, a stranger to them, an enemy, and take a wedding ring from his hand and a photograph of a small child from inside his coat, and set both of them aside, carefully, in an envelope, to be carried back across an ocean and a war, so that a widow in some bombed-out German town might one day hold them in her hands again. More than 3,000 German soldiers were buried at Margraten, right there alongside the Americans. The enemy did for these dead what their own leaders had long since stopped doing, even for the living. That is what haunted them. Not the losing, the mercy. Because mercy from an enemy asks a question a bullet never can. It asks you to look hard at everything you were told, and at every man who told it to you, and to wonder quietly what else in your whole life had been a lie. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945, and you would think that was the end of the story. The dead were buried, the records were kept, the terrible job was finished. But Margraten was only about to become something almost impossible to believe, because now the living had to decide what all these graves were going to mean, and the people who decided were not soldiers at all. They were the ordinary families of one small Dutch town who had watched every bit of this happen in their own fields. In the spring of 1945, as the first peacetime Memorial Day came around, the people who lived near Margraten began walking out to the cemetery on their own. No one ordered them to. They came carrying flowers cut from their own gardens, and they laid them on the graves of American boys they had never met. Boys from a country most of them would never see, who had crossed an ocean to die freeing a nation that was not even their own. Then someone in the village had an idea that would outlive every single person who first heard it. What if each grave were adopted? What if one specific family, one specific person, one specific child took a single American as their own responsibility forever, to come and visit him, to bring him flowers on the days that mattered, to learn his name and where in America he had come from, and, if it could be done, to write a letter to the mother he had left behind and tell her that her son was not lying alone in a foreign field, that someone here knew his name, that someone here would stand in for her and grieve him since she could not cross the sea to do it herself. By the second Memorial Day after the war, in 1946, every single grave had been adopted, almost 18,000 of them. 100%, every name carved on the wall of the missing adopted too. Not one American in that cemetery was left without a Dutch family who had claimed him as one of theirs. And they never stopped. That is the part people simply cannot believe the first time they hear it. This was not a gesture for one sad season. The adoptions were handed down, from parents to their children, from those children to their grandchildren. 80 years later, the graves at Margraten are still tended by Dutch families, many of them descended from the very people who started it back in 1945. There is a waiting list. Right now, today, there are hundreds of Dutch people waiting for the chance to adopt an American grave, hoping that one day an existing family will pass one on to them, so that they can take their turn caring for a soldier who died 2 full generations before they were even born. They keep the names alive, which was the entire point from the very first shovel of frozen earth, that no one lying there would ever be allowed to become no one. But not every grave at Margraten was going to stay filled, because back in America, hundreds of thousands of mothers were about to be asked an impossible question. Starting in 1947, the United States did something that no nation had ever tried on anything like this scale. It offered to bring its dead home. They called it the Return of the Dead program, and it laid an unbearable choice in the hands of grieving families. The choice went first to the widow, and if there was no widow, to the parents. Your son is buried in Europe, in a cemetery kept beautiful by people who love him. You may leave him there, among the men he served with, in the ground he died to set free. Or you may bring him home, to be buried down the road, close enough to visit on a Sunday afternoon. There was no correct answer. There were only 2 different kinds of grief, and every family had to pick one. More than 250,000 American dead were recovered from battlefields around the world. About 60% of the families chose to bring their sons home, from 86 countries across 6 continents. That came to more than 170,000 men, lifted carefully out of the earth by the same kind of graves registration soldiers who had buried them in the first place and carried back across the sea. The whole effort cost more than $160 million, and the men doing the identifying got a name right for nearly 97 out of every 100 they handled. In October of 1947, the first ship carrying the European dead came into New York Harbor. It was called the Joseph V. Connolly, and it held more than 6,000 flag-draped caskets down in its hold. As it came in, a single coffin was carried through the streets of the city to stand for all of them. And 400,000 Americans came out into those streets and stood in complete silence to watch it pass. 400,000 people, on an ordinary working day, not saying a word, while one casket went by. The men who were not brought home were gathered into 14 new permanent American military cemeteries, most of them in Europe. Margraten became one of them, and an escort soldier rode with every single coffin all the way to its final grave and folded a flag over it, and placed that flag into the hands of a mother or a wife, and stayed with the family a while, because no one in that country was meant to receive their dead alone, and the German dead were moved as well. In late 1946, the enemy soldiers who had been buried at Margraten by American hands were lifted out again, just as carefully, and carried to a place called Ijsselstein, also in Holland, which over the years grew into the largest German war cemetery in the world. More than 30,000 of them lie there now, under their own markers, with their own names, in their own tended rows. Even in total defeat, even as the full horror of what their nation had done was becoming clear to everyone alive, their enemy had refused to let them rot in the ground as nameless things. They too were given a grave that a grieving family could someday find. That, in the end, was the American answer to the question that German prisoner could never stop asking himself. Why? Why would you do this for us? And the honest answer was never really about us or them at all. It was about the name. It was about a stubborn and deeply American idea that a human being does not stop mattering the very moment he stops breathing, that a dead body is not garbage to be buried and forgotten, that every last one of them, friend and enemy alike, had been somebody's entire world, and so every last one deserved to be found and named and remembered by somebody. Which brings us finally to the number that nobody likes to say out loud. Even now, 80 years later, more than 70,000 American service members from the Second World War have never been found. 70,000, still out there, in jungles, on the floors of oceans, under fields that went back to farmland a lifetime ago. And there is an agency of the United States government, the Defense POW and MIA Accounting Agency, whose entire job, to this very day, is to keep looking for them, to keep the exact promise those graves registration men made in the mud, that no one gets left behind, that no one is ever allowed to become no one. The men who made that promise were, for a very long time, half forgotten themselves, the black soldiers who dug the graves of a country that would not let them vote, the exhausted young men who cut the dead out of the surf and wrote their names down in the rain. Jefferson Wiggins came home from all of it, from helping bury 20,000 of his countrymen by hand, to a home state, Alabama, where a black man still could not freely vote. It took the country most of the rest of his long life to even begin to say, thank you. And the German prisoner, whoever he was, went home too, in the end, back to a ruined country, to try to build some kind of a life out of the wreckage. But he carried something out of that field that his officers had never given him and never could. He had watched his enemy stand over the body of a dead man, an enemy body, a body they owed absolutely nothing to, and choose, every single time, to write down the name. There is an old truth underneath all of this, and those graves registration men understood it better than almost anyone. A grave with a name on it is a promise somebody kept. A grave with no name is a question that no one ever got to answer. Those men spent the worst years of their lives making sure that as few of those unanswered questions were left in the ground as they could possibly manage. For their own men, yes, and when the moment came, for the enemy as well. So here is the one thing I want to ask of you tonight. Somewhere in your family, going back, there was very likely a man who went over to Europe, a grandfather, a great-uncle, a name that comes up maybe once a year, if it comes up at all. Maybe he came home and would never speak a word about what he saw. Maybe he never came home, and he lies right now under one of those white crosses, tended by a Dutch family who still, after 80 long years, walks out and brings him flowers. Tell me his name. Just his name, down in the comments below, and where he served if you happen to know it, because that is the whole point of everything you just heard me say. A name spoken out loud is a man who has not been forgotten yet, and I will make you this promise. I read every one of them, every name any of you leaves down there, and this small, quiet corner of the internet will hold on to him, right alongside the 17,000 who lie at Margraten and the 70,000 who are still waiting out there to be found and finally brought home. Say his name. We will keep it.